Okay, that's us recording. So I'll start with a big welcome. So thank you to all of you who are joining us today, say all of you who are here in the present and those of you who are watching in the future as well. So this is the Hidden Histories of North Ayrshire workshop for Garnock Connections. It's going to be a great workshop. I'm really excited for this one. But what I do want to say just before we get started is that really the purpose of these workshops is to give you the sort of basic skills and information that you need to be able to do this kind of research for yourself, this history research, this archaeology research for yourselves. And really what we would love to see is you using the Places That We Know app to create heritage trails for places that you know, that you are aware of, that you're fascinated by in the area. I've talked a little bit about that in some of the other workshops, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. You can catch up with the recordings if you've not seen those workshops before. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Claire and Louise. So Claire, I'll just make you a host.
Okay, right, we're ready to roll. Right, today we are going to talk about the hidden histories of buildings. And we all know what a building is. Basically, they're probably very underappreciated because they're a key part of our lives. They form the backdrop to our everyday interactions. They're where we live, where we work, where we spend our leisure time. They provide us with storage, shelter, transportation links, etc. They are crucial and key to our existence. And I think we are all in danger of taking them a bit for granted. So as you can see from the selection I've chosen for this introductory slide, they vary greatly in character, both between buildings, and they vary over time. So a building can last for an extremely long duration, as long as it's maintained. And during this time, as long as it remains fit for purpose, and also depending on how willing and able its owners are to actually renovate and repair it, they can sort of last without getting replaced. So some can last for centuries, though they're often extended and remodeled. And in some cases, they can bear little resemblance to their original form. So today we're going to look at buildings, and hopefully you'll learn a bit more about understanding a building and reading its time depth and its character. And to be honest, buildings archaeology has become more and more important over recent decades. And now there's a specific sector of our profession which specializes in their recording and interpretation. So today, Claire and I are going to take you through several categories of building. And they'll probably seem familiar on the face of it, but hopefully we'll help you to look at them more thoroughly and more deeply, so that you can spot little details which can help you learn more about its life story and its history. So, but before we do this, I'm just going to give you a quick guide to the actual art of building survey. Now, it can vary very much in the amount of detail. Sometimes it can involve massively detailed drawings of every wall face, and lasts for months upon months upon months. But a lot of the time it's actually done through photography. So it means it's a skill set that's very accessible to everyone. So when it's done in a professional capacity, again, this work can be very thorough. So care is taken to show the building in its wider landscape setting, and also to record every elevation inside and out of each room. Original details such as doorways, windows, fireplaces, skirting boards, all sorts of things may be recorded in great detail. And your aim is to create a detailed record of the structure, which sometimes is before its renovation, but quite often is before its demolition, so that your record is the only record that there is left of the structure. I'm going to say very quickly that this work is not limited to the professionals. This is an instance where you, the interested amateur, can play a massively important role in recording your heritage. So not all historic buildings are considered important enough to merit detailed recording, and some are lost without record because the planning rules just didn't consider them important enough to be recorded before planning permission was granted. So this is the reason why for my introductory photo, I've chosen the former Struthers Lemonade Factory in Church Street, Lochwinnoch. I photographed this site a few years ago, not as an archaeologist, but as an interested amateur, or an interested local rather, who just happened to be an archaeologist. I've approached the task of recording it in a professional manner, even though my ability to compile a detailed record was completely hamstrung because I couldn't gain access to the building or the grounds. And so what I was able to record was limited. But what I've got on the left is a general setting shot, which shows the site in its larger landscape setting. And then to the right, we see some very difficult elevation shots. If you're doing a decent elevation shot, you should be looking straight onto the building and getting it as straight as possible. But you quite often find that due to circumstances beyond your control, such as other buildings, street furniture, whatever, you can't get the straight on look. So you can see with the middle picture, which is the long elevation of the side, that was a case in point. It was just impossible. So what I've got here, it's not a brilliant record, but it is a record, and that's better than nothing. And the building itself was demolished a few years ago with no archaeological works undertaken. So I'll talk about it a bit later so you can actually learn a bit more about the history of this rather humble building. But before then, Claire and I are going to take you through a nice range of building types and talk a bit more about them. So we're going to start off with the nice dramatic one, which is castles and tower houses, which I've described here as defensive homes with attitude. So basically, it's an iconic form of building is the castle. And technically, you can argue that the true meaning of a castle is a building where the owners have been granted a so-called license to crenellate. That's basically where the monarch has said, okay, you can put battlements on your structure. And of course, the battlements are these little lumps that you get in every child's castle drawing, where you can have archers or later on artillery people hiding behind them and taking pot shots at anyone who's got the temerity to aim at the place. So crenellations aside, what we're talking about in this group is defensive structures. And normally you can tell these by the fact their walls are massively thick, like over 1 meter, quite often battered. So they're sloping at the bottom and going up. They sort of become straight as they go up. And they're often placed in a defensive site. Now, I'm not going to talk over much about the earliest form of castles, which are the earth and timber Motte and Bailey castles, which you're probably familiar with. But there are some nice examples in Bridge of Weir, and there's also one near Dreghorn. But I thought I'd focus today more on the later tower houses. So earth and timber castles were the first kind of structure, but most of them were actually replaced by stone castles later on. And as time went on and artillery and attacks became more and more sophisticated, so the defenses of the castle had to become more sophisticated in order to actually counteract them. So eventually you get, in say the late 13th and into the early 14th century, the likes of Edward I commissions masons to create really specialized and highly engineered castles, particularly in Wales, which are designed to form areas of defense within a country which can be occupied by an occupying force, or conversely, if you're a defensive force, you can occupy them against the occupying force. So Edward I and the Scottish castles worked so well for him that when Robert the Bruce came to the throne, he had an edict that basically no new castles were to be built, and a lot of them actually got slighted at this point. And from this point on, the dominant form became the tower house. And basically what this in Scotland is a fortified house. And because they're keeping the footprint of their house small, it's on a sort of small plan and it's set vertically with each room above one another. So we're actually going to look in detail at one particular castle, and that's Garnock Castle. Now, according to historical records, this is an earlier castle which has its roots in the medieval period, but the remains we see today appear to be a tower house which has been described and interpreted as being late 15th century in date. Now, work on it is kind of limited in terms of detailed study, so it's hard to say whether it's a multi-phase structure. From the face of it, it appears quite simple, but it's an excellent example of a tower house which you can visit, and it'll get you an introductory idea of how these places are set out. So the earlier castles were usually set within this massively defensive curtain wall, but the later tower houses, which as I said are just defensive houses basically, have instead of this curtain wall a thinner, lighter barmkin wall, which is basically just a way of keeping the neighbours out. But if Edward I rolled up, you'd just have to wave the white flag because it wouldn't last at all. And you can see from the plan of Garnock here how we've got the massive thick walls of the so-called keep, which is the tower house element, and then the much thinner barmkin wall. So this is a really distinctive form of tower house, but you'll often find that it's only the tower house itself that survives. No traces of the barmkin wall are usually left. So Garnock's a very unusual example in that respect. So here we have a view of what is essentially the heart of the house. This would have provided the family's accommodation. So quite often you get the basement, which is used for storage. Sometimes then the kitchens, but when Garnock, it's a different case, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then living accommodations, which is usually the main hall. So this is a public space. You entertain your guests there, and then it's the bedrooms above. But you've got to remember that in this period, which is the late medieval period and into the early modern, the bedroom is also a space where you carry out private business. So if you're having a meeting with the laird, it won't be in the hall, which is the public space. He'll take you upstairs and you will be in his private presence chamber, which just so happens to double up as his bedroom. And then you may have another floor for the lady of the house above, and the servants, I'm afraid, are usually just left to fend for themselves and find a space wherever they can. So that's kind of how this part of the building works. Now, what we're going to do now, is we see the buildings around the outside as well. So around our barmkin area, we've got a series of stone-built buildings, which in this case are 2 stories high, so they're quite substantial. And these would have provided extra accommodation, say, for guests, stabling, workshops. So what you have is a small community which has its heart within the tower house. And most of the time we get absolutely no traces of this community left in the landscape because they are erased. Okay, a more detailed look at this castle now. Now, I want you to look as far as you can, and I know we're limited kind of by the quality of the photographs and the ability to zoom in. I hope if you take a really close look, you can see that there's 2 areas at the very base of the tower house and also just above the arched opening, where the stonework's really sort of smaller and closer together. And you can see a more detailed picture on the right of one of these areas, the one at the base. And it just looks a bit different and a bit odd. Now, if you see this in the flesh, you'll see that the sort of the wall curves outwards slightly. So what we have here is the remains of the springing, as it's called, for a vaulted chamber. So I have very helpfully got a picture of Dundonald, and you can see exactly where this is. So you can see how Dundonald has got a vaulted chamber at first floor level here. And then there's the remains of another vaulted chamber at the floor above. So again, one of these vaults is intact, but the one at the upper story level, you can only see because these little springing stones have survived at the base. So you can tell from that our very dilapidated keep would have had some similarity to the way in which Dundonald's laid out, though I would point out that with Garnock, we seem to have the vaulting at the basement level and then maybe at first floor. But I'm hoping that this shows you how just a more detailed look at the stonework and a comparison with other sites which are in better condition can actually tell you a bit more about your structure. Now, if you move on from that with Garnock, again, this is quite a sort of difficult photo to show it, but you can see the grass covered entrance is again another vaulted chamber, similar to what we've seen the remains of in the Tower House. And that has been interpreted as a kitchen because it's got a large fireplace in it. So you can start seeing how this castle is laid out from these little details, and you're now getting insights into how the whole place was put together. So you now know that the kitchen wasn't in the Tower House in this one, but was located separately, which is a very smart and sensible idea because kitchens tend to go on fire. And so to have it in a distant place from your house is smart, but though you have to get used to the fact the food is probably cold by the time it reaches your table. But nevertheless, we've got a good insight into the structure. So one last thing we're going to look at Garnock is, again, just make sure you keep a nice little weather eye for detail and anything that strikes you as odd. Because what we have hidden at one of the corners of the Barmkin wall in Garnock Castle, and I hope you can see just here, there are some rounded mouldings to the stones at the very corner, which I've tried to take a photo of, but a not very helpful tree is obscuring it. Now, this would have been one of these Bartizan type pepper pot towers that basically stuck out on the edge of your edge of your wall. You sometimes get them on the tower houses as well. Craigie Var's a good example, which has got them. And it basically it provides someone with a lookout point and maybe a chance to take aim with it would be a handgun at this time, or a crossbow. And these little details can survive, but you need to have a good close look at the structure. So don't rush it, look round and make sure you're looking at your castle with a detailed eye. So before we leave, I'm just going to add a little postscript, and that's hints at looking at more complex structures. Now, Garnock was nice and straightforward, or at least we think it has, because we haven't really had a chance to have a really detailed look at it. A much more complicated castle is that of Ardrossan, which is on the site of one of these earlier castles that has since been slighted. Now, we know, and probably Claire can contradict me at some points, that we've got a sort of documentary sources putting it back to mid-12th, I think, but it was further remodeled in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, very helpfully, they've used different sources of stone for some of the remodeling. So we've got yellow sandstone, which is possibly representing some of the earlier 14th century work at the ground floor level of this castle. And we're looking again at a keep similar to what we were dealing with, the Tower House at Garnock. And in the 15th century, somebody has helpfully filled in the doorway with red sandstone. So obviously the doorway had to be there before it was filled in. So therefore, the yellow fabric comes before the pink fabric, and hey presto, you've now got two phases of castle. So oh, keep an eye on things like that. And again, you look round the other side, you can see how the pink sandstone has been used to infill this space and how it's been used to provide a living space. So there's fireplaces here. So what was probably a very ornate and imposing gatehouse inhabited by a couple of guards who were keeping eyes open on who was coming to the front door now becomes the living space. And again, like Glengarnock, we have our kitchen, which is again covered with a barrel vault. And again, we've got the nice helpful pink stone here. So the builders of Ardrossan were very helpful in helping us interpret the site, but sometimes it can be more tricky. And here my example, I'm hoping it's not going to scoot ahead now because I didn't think it was going to move. One last thing for this point is Seagate Castle. Now, at some point in the 19th century, somebody has done a refurbishment and they have made very great efforts to make it appear very similar to the original, which can really create a headache for a buildings archaeologist. So I've put up two windows here and they're very similar on the face of it. But when you compare one and the other, one has got really hefty blocks supporting it, which are not very squared off, and they're just rough looking and solid and just more, it's just more grandiose. And the other ones are much smaller and a lightweight, one might say, and squared. So I would infer from this that the big grandiose blocks on the left-hand side are our original window, and then the one on the right-hand side, which seems straighter and more sort of more neatly worked, one might say, with the smaller blocks, is actually a later repair. So again, just keep an eye open in that for details like that. So before we leave the defended house, we'll just sort of talk a little about what happened to a lot of them. And later on, as the rule of law became firmer, you weren't likely to get burnt out of house and home by your neighbours over a feudal dispute. People realised that their accommodation was rather cramped and unpleasant. So they started to make much larger stately homes, sometimes with a baronial air. So you can see we have a nice castellated structure here at Eglinton. Sometimes they incorporated the old family pile within the footprint of the later house. Sometimes the old family pile was demolished and turned into a quarry for the raw materials. But from this point on, we start having the country house rather than the castle. And then it was only much later that the Victorian castles actually took on the style of the old Gothic pile and created places like we think of today as a lot of the Victorian mansions. And I think with that, I am going to finish up with castles and turn to Claire for places of worship.
Right. Hi everyone. Are you happy just with your sound on, Louise, or you want me muted?
I shall mute. Do you need me to hand over control to you, or are you all?
No, I'll just wait till you mute and then I'll take it back off. We do this control thing every time. But we're getting better, I feel. I think we're getting better. Do you want me to just mute you? See if I can do that. Slides, right, that should have, right, excellent. Right, hi everyone. So yes, I'm going to start and cover places of worship. For the most part, historically speaking, this will be Christianity. So I will start a wee bit of a background, but don't worry, I know we're aiming at things, but I just wanted to give you a setting up of what we'll look at later, and also to show you that just because there isn't buildings remaining from this earlier period doesn't mean it wasn't active. So this is just a kind of early example. This is a reconstruction drawing that's up on the screen at the moment. So just to run through this kind of fact. So Scotland was predominantly Christian during the medieval period. Now, Christianity began to appear after the 5th and 6th centuries. It was St Ninian who set up the first kind of abbey at Whithorn, the first monastery, and then that spread throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, with the first abbeys appearing in the 6th century following St Ninian, and there was more monasteries that were introduced by Christians from mainland Europe and from Ireland. So by the early 8th century, most of the population of Scotland was Christian. Now, the early monasteries consisted of a cluster of small wooden or stone huts in which the monks slept and worked, and an oratory or tiny chapel, often enclosed by a substantial ditch and bank. The early churches were small and simple rectangular buildings at the east end, built of timber, so that's why nothing much remains of those now. So unfortunately for our buildings talks, we have very few buildings remaining within our area from the early Christian period. From the Garnock Connection area, it tends to be more a case of kind of remains of carved stonework, and also things like King's Cave over in Arran, which has the kind of early Christian era carvings into the rock faces of the side of the cave wall. So when we want to try and look at buildings, I'm now going to move a bit forward onto the medieval places of worship that do still have upstanding remains, and I'm going to look at two kind of areas, examples, which is going to be parish churches and abbeys. There are other buildings out there, other types of forms, but that's limited by time. I'll try and narrow the focus slightly. So the earliest parish churches still standing today date from the 12th century, when the parish system was established within Scotland. Now, parishes which have defined boundaries were generally served by a single church, and a lot of these early parishes survive, but mostly as ruined shells or incorporated into later buildings. Within our area, an example of one of these early churches is the Ardrossan. Now, unfortunately, it would be difficult to argue that this requires a building recording. There is very little of it left, as you can see, so it's a good example. But I do like the reconstruction. It's a good example of this early kind of simple form, single-celled, rectangular structure form of this kind of early parish church. I also think I've used that reconstruction drawing in every talk I've done so far for Garnock Connections, so I'm making good use of it now. I might eventually stop. I don't know. But I wouldn't count on it. But yeah, so you've got the simple start of these parish churches is that the interior would have been divided into two sections, a nave and a smaller chancel. So the chancel would have been at the eastern end. It would have held the altar, and it was for the clergy. The nave, which was larger, would have been the western end, and it would have provided space for the lay people to stand or sit and worship. So what you've got is you have this division of space between where the clergy would hang out, would be, and where the lay congregation would be. Now, in these simple rectangular structures, this kind of division of space would be achieved by kind of internal furnishings. So I know that in the excavation of the Ardrossan parish church, it was kind of found that there was 3 steps in the middle that marked that division between the nave and the chancel. But there is other examples out with our area that I just wanted to show that are still upstanding, so you can get more of an idea of these early parish churches. So this is St Blaine's Church, which is over in Bute, which dates from the 12th century. So you can see here on the left-hand side is your kind of longer nave section. And it has been extended in the 13th century, but most of this is still the original early 12th century fabric. And then this will be the chancel. Now you can see in this, they've actually, which is why I put this in. So this is you looking from the nave down towards the chancel. You can see that they've actually created this kind of nice archway. So it's a bit more of a substantial division than just kind of internal steps and furnishings in that sense. And this is Cruggleton at Sorby. This is down in Dumfries and Galloway, but this is actually upstanding. You can see this. Now, the reason, I mean, it is 12th century, it was largely restored in the kind of later 19th century, but there was enough material left over that they were able to do a decent reconstruction. So it's actually, yeah, I haven't been to see it, but now it's on one of my lists of things to visit, many things after the restrictions left. So you can see there that it's also separated into this kind of larger nave and this chancel. There is a bit of the structure itself also has a kind of obvious division between the two that you can see. And also this is a nice look at the interior, looking again from the nave into the chancel, and you can see that moulded archway that they've used as a division. Dalmeny in Edinburgh. Now this is, get my facts right. So yeah, this is essentially an example of occasionally a wealthy patron might commission a more elaborate church. So this might have a semicircular apse at the east end, so this you can kind of see in the exterior of it, containing the altar, and perhaps a square tower at the west. Now you can see in that we plan, they've added a north transit, but I like this angle view of the church because you don't see that later addition. And the west tower, while that was a later addition, it actually replaces what would have been, there would have been a west tower that was then demolished at one point. And you can definitely see the beautiful interior here, that this is the kind of molded archways. So this is looking from the nave into your kind of square chancel, and then through to your semicircular apse at the back. And it's also from Dalmeny that I had that little gargoyle at the start, which I liked because it's got lots of different details around these, shooting ahead, around the kind of molded archways. Now, the other thing I wanted to look at is abbeys. Now, there's obviously, you could do an entire lecture on abbeys. So I'm going to try and keep it very slimline, but I will not be able to address all of the things to think about. But so by the 10th century, the early monasteries that I mentioned, now they were in decline for various reasons. One exciting one is obviously the Vikings, kept coming in and reading a bunch of them, but generally they were declined for a few different reasons. So Celtic monasticism, that's kind of how you refer to that earlier stuff, has now largely died out. But due to a drive by royalty, it was David I, and it was his mother before him, started getting quite into reintroducing these kind of abbeys and monasteries back into life. And it was through them that European orders of monks and nuns were gradually introduced. Now, I love these names because they always get me tongue-tied. Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, and others. And there's other ones that I'm not even, I'm much easier writing them down than reading them out loud. So many of the new abbeys were founded by members of royalty or the nobility who hoped that the round of prayer offered up by the monks on their behalf would speed their passage to heaven, freeing them to concentrate on worldly matters. This also allowed for them to demonstrate their will to the subjects. Now, I was going to do a wee section of terminology just because I think it helps me, because you get so many different buildings. Abbeys, strictly speaking, were named because they were a community of monks headed by an abbot. Lower in status than the abbeys were the priories, headed by priors, and next in line were the collegiate churches. These were built by major landowners to provide masses for the salvation of their soul, and colleges of priests were brought together for that purpose. Now, a very nice example of this is the Castle Semple Collegiate Church, which I did try to squeeze in, Louise, but there was not enough time. But you can go and visit, and it's got lots of lovely images online, and it's a great example. Now, slightly different were the friaries. Now, the friaries were where the inmates went out into the world preaching rather than devoting their lives to prayer within the cloister, which was more what abbey life was about. And all of these institutions could be known as monasteries, containing, as they did, community of monks, or nunneries for the smaller number of parallel institutions for women. Okay, so today I'm just going to run through Cowinning Abbey fairly quickly. It's just going to be tricky, but a little bit of history. It was a Tyrrhensian house, which was established by monks from Kelso in the 12th century. Now, the Tyrrhensian order, unique in Scotland, coming directly from France rather than via a settlement in England. Over the next 400 years, Cowinning Abbey became one of the wealthiest and most flourishing monasteries in Scotland. That's a lovely aerial view. Now, the architecture of these new abbeys and nunneries was far more sophisticated than the old Celtic foundations, and were generally built to a standard layout. Their buildings were arranged around that central square cloister, and around which the living accommodation is placed, and the church usually sits on the north side so as not to block sunlight from the open cloister. Now, at Cowinning, you can see the outline of the cross-shaped church at the top there. I've lost my little arrow here, because it's actually, this is a later parish church, which I've got later on, so don't worry too much about it now, but that shows you where it lies. And so you can see that this kind of cross-shaped church, you've got the navel here, western transit, and this would have been your kind of transit, so north and south, and your chancel would have been at that end. Now, there would have been an outer precinct with lots of various other buildings and structures in it, and they would have all been enclosed by a sturdy boundary wall, but we'll just focus on the abbey itself. Just a couple of things to move on, you've got the refectory at Coewinning was in the south range, this in the kitchen. So the refectory was essentially the long open dining room. Obviously the cloister in the middle, so the cloisters is that kind of cloister arcade would have been the wee walkway that you always associate with abbeys that goes around a nice square cloister garth, which is the garden that sits in the middle of the cloister arcade. So that was for them. Oh, and a fun fact before we move on is the warming room. There was only 2 places in this large abbey that would have a fire, and one was the kitchen for cooking, obviously, and the other was the warming room. And the warming room was the only place that had a fire purely for getting some heat for yourself. And it was like a common room for the monks, although there was no talking permitted, and monks were only allowed to gather here for short periods. So they really were serious about taking that. I don't think I would last in an abbey that size in Coewinning without fire, to be honest. Anyway, but they did it. Now, this is an example. This is the doorway. Actually, I'll go back one so I can show you. This is this southeast processional entrance that goes into the nave. Okay, now this is from the Historic Environment Scotland Statement of Significance. The earliest part of the church with diagnostic architectural detail is the southeast processional doorway from the cloister to the south nave aisle. Its water leaf caps and ring moulded arch order point to a date in the late 12th century, although the dogtooth of the hood mould suggests it is unlikely to be long before 1200. Now, I know that you guys, that's exactly what you thought when you saw this. It was much like my thoughts as well. I thought, wow, that dog tooth, that's some late 12th century stuff going on there. But the reason I put this up is it's beautiful. It's a great example that shows the level of detail and architecture that went into abbeys and why they're so good an example at looking at architecture and getting your eye in for these things. But no, you do not need to know all of this. When we do a building recording, we take photographs of every doorway and every window. When you can recognize a detail, you take a little close up of the detail. But this is the kind of thing you would sit and you would look at in more detail later on, or you would talk to somebody who is really into their abbey architecture. But do not be put off. You do not need to know all the terminology and recognize the dates of your roll mouldings and your dogtooth styles and various things like that. What you will find though is that when you go through around old buildings is that a lot of things are more obvious. So I just wanted to run through a couple of things, although they will be fairly quick. So this is in the nave. So Coewinning Abbey, the thing to see here is you can see the nave. This is you kind of looking east towards the west end of the nave. So you would have had a tower on both sides. This looks to be an earlier entrance part of the Abbey Church. This obviously much later tower that was a replacement in 1815, 1816. You can see this, these are quite obvious things. And this gable in the middle is a later insertion. Now you can tell that roughly. This seems to be a recessed gable. I've got a slightly more zoomed in look here. So this is looking at the kind of southwest end of the nave. But you can kind of tell it doesn't join up great. It's different kind of architecture, but it's more that you can see it's an inserted recessed gable. Now this reflects the fact that after the Reformation, which Louise is going to talk a bit more about, they kind of altered the nave to make it into a parish church. So as well as inserting in, so they shortened it, they inserted in this west gable wall. There was one at the eastern end, but it's gone now. They closed up, you can see this closed doorway. These things you'll be able to spot as you walk around the Abbey, just anywhere, walk around, see if you can spot these things. And that was along this wall here. So they closed up certain entrances along either side to create this new kind of parish church area. So you can kind of, these are a bit more obvious to the eye that you're able to see these modifications, and they actually play an important part in the history of the use of this land. I just wanted to go through, these are the two later structures. You've got the West Tower. Now there was a West Tower that lasted actually through most of the conversions on the site, but it fell down in 1809. Well, it didn't fall down, it got damaged and slighted, and then they took it down and they rebuilt it about 1815, 1816. Very worth pointing out that the West Tower is now the location of the kind of the Coewinning Heritage Tower, little museum that you can go in and you can walk the 100 steps up to the top of the tower and get amazing views such as this one on the left. This is where all our aerial photos have been taken from, so definitely worth a visit. This is the later parish church, which was about 1774. So these are obviously, you can see them later insertions, very dramatic, so that's nice. Just briefly want to talk about the West Range, but I won't go into it too much. It was just more, this is quite a difficult bit to pick out and make sense of, and the reason for that is because, I don't know if you can quite tell, so that's your tower there. That's that inserted gable end that we pointed at, and here's a bunch of tenement buildings that were here till about the 1950s. So so the actual West Range had a tenement building on top of it, and there was also some in the Cloister Garth as well. So this is very much changing. This will have a big impact on how we looked. The other thing to point out with Coinning Abbey is obviously you can see those buildings are now gone, and that was in the 1960s. The kind of public works came in, the Ministry of Public Works came in, and when it came under state guardianship, they knocked a bunch of buildings down. They consolidated. You can see, you know, you've got bits here capped on top of the walls and things like that. And this is actually a bit of a rebuild, this bit here, because so they neatened it up. This isn't actually where the refectory is in that area, but it's not exactly on the line of where the refectory was, because we did some test pitting and we found an earlier wall just off the line. So yes, they also dug a whole bunch of things, did landscaping, and did quite a lot of work without doing much record of what they had done. So so definitely when you go to these sites, please remember that there's hundreds of years of activity that has gone on them. But like I say, the good thing with buildings as opposed to archaeology and below ground is that you'll be able to wander around and see them, a lot of them quite clearly to your eye. But I shall finish and hand you back to Louise, because I think Louise is going to look at what happened after 1560, which was a big change in places of worship. And she can't unmute herself, so I will.
Right, lovely. Okay, I know we're all looking forward to our cup of tea, so make this very quick. I think the computer will work. I've asked it to move, but that should work. Yeah. Yes. Here we are. Oh, I've skipped on too much. Right. The Reformation of 1560 brought about a profound change in the way in which people actually worshipped God. So as Claire's been talking about before, in the Catholic Church, the priest had actually acted as an intermediary between worshippers and God. And worship at this time was very visual and sensual, with colours and song and masses sung in Latin, which you weren't expected to understand. The priests were up there doing their business-like things in the chancel, and you just gathered about in the nave and probably talked to your pals. It was very bright and very colourful. Now, followers of Protestantism believed in an entirely different relationship with God, so they saw no need for this intermediary. Anyone could build their own relationship with God through reading the Bible in their own vernacular tongue, and the minister was there to provide guidance and instruction for his flock. So this in the end led to the complete redesign of church interiors, and in time it meant the loss of some churches and their replacement with new forms. To begin with, though, the medieval buildings were often retained because it was just too expensive to build a new one. But their brightly coloured interiors would have been whitewashed and their artworks were removed. And at an early stage, John Knox stipulated that certain elements had to be present because they were vital to Protestant worship. These were a pulpit, a basin for baptisms, a communion table, and a bell to call the congregation for prayer. And these elements would have been present at every post-Reformation church. So here we have Kilburney Parish Church, which is a surviving medieval structure, and the bell tower at the end is actually of 15th century origin, though I suspect the little bell cut might be later. So this is a structure that was retained and actually enlarged through the addition of these aisles. And the spectacular thing about Kilburney Parish Church is that it actually retains its post-medieval woodwork. So Then we can see how the building was being extended with these addition of these little crow step structures. So you can see the extent of the timber work here, and this shows you a really good example of the revised layout. So instead of having that subdivision between the sacred space of the chancel and the lay space of the nave, the focus was on the pulpit, which we see on the right, because that's where the minister would be preaching to you from. And that large timber thing above the pulpit, in this case, is actually a sounding board, so that the voice of the minister is actually magnified through coming off this timber panel. Pews were added, that was because sometimes in the very lengthy sermons, it was helpful to have your congregation seated. And the other focus in the space was the communion table, which I believe is here on the left-hand side with the blue. This was an integral part of Protestant worship. The Catholic faith had believed that the priest was the only one to partake of the blood and body of Christ, and they believed in transubstantiation, which was the magical transformation of bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ. But the Protestants did not believe in this at all, but they still came together to have communion. But this, in their case, was symbolically replicating the Last Supper. So the congregation would come together at certain occasions as a community to eat at the same table, and this emphasized their fellowship. So Kilbirnie is a particularly spectacular example of a surviving medieval church, which has been entirely remodeled. And we know from John Knox and the whole Protestant ethos that they believed in this austere religion where the focus was entirely on the word. But I hope that you are noticing that there are some nice little bits of decoration and ostentation in this church. The sounding board is rather dramatic. And if you look at the structure on the left, which is a lairds loft, not only did this allow a great opportunity for decorative work, so you see all the heraldry and the carved woodwork, it also provided a nice bit of neat social differentiation. So the congregation might have been gathering together as a fellowship, but the laird and his family and his cronies were still able to sit in the lairds loft above and look down on his tenantry and the common folk below. In a lot of cases, as towns or donors became more successful, the old medieval churches were considered too cramped. In Kilbirnie's case, it was extended and survived, but in a few cases, the original church has been entirely removed, but leaving just a little bell tower behind. So you actually get them quite often around here. Well, in a comparative sense, there's one at Beath and there's one at Loch Winnoch in Old Simon, where the west end of the church with its bell cote has been retained as a bell tower. In the case of Old Simon, it's sitting in the old cemetery, whereas in Beath, it's actually retained in the churchyard along with the modern church. And as new churches were developed, completely new forms were met with, which actually sort of used the layout of the focus on the pulpit and the communion table. So you get round churches like the church in Bowmore, and octagonal churches like the Free Church in Loch Winnoch. So I think on that note, what we have to remember as well is that our built heritage at the moment is dominated by places of Christian worship, but in the future it will be much more diverse as we have synagogues, mosques, temples, and all manner of diversified churches appearing. So the buildings historians of 200 years down the line will have a much more diverse and varied portfolio, which they'll have to become familiar with. And I think that is us for this first half. We'll just be brisk in the second half. It's all right.
We can do that.
Very much, both Louise and Claire. Let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back I'm going to cut it a little bit short actually, because it would be nice to come back sort of at 12 o'clock.
Right.
So Claire, Louise and I will turn our video off, and when we're back on, that will be us ready to start again. So enjoy your breaks everyone, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back everyone.
Okay, right, I'm going to crack on to have we got everyone back, I think? Yeah, good. Right, I will crack on with the second half. I managed to chow down a couple of biscuits really quick there, so I should be ready to go. That was good. So, farms. Now, I don't think you can talk about architecture and building recording in Scotland without looking at farms. Know that they're not as exciting and dramatic and interesting as castles and abbeys that we've seen so far, but you might be a bit surprised by the history of farmsteads, and you will, I hope, after today, look at them in a bit of a different light, especially when you're wandering around and suddenly you'll start to see things that you might not have spotted before. The big thing with architecture in Scotland is there was a huge turning point. It was the agricultural revolution, which took place in the 18th and 19th centuries and known as the improvement era. Now, such was the impact of this improvement era that we have a before and an after when it comes to looking at farmsteads in Scotland and when it comes to looking at their architecture. Now, just briefly in the before period, no, don't worry, I'm not going this far back, but again, just to set it up, farming has been around in Scotland since the start of the Neolithic period around 4000 BC. By its very nature, those 6,000 years of farming practices tend to see the same pockets of land being constantly reused, and so you have a lot of result in the removal of earlier traces. Now, there are some exceptions, especially Highland areas. You can kind of see palimpsests of enclosures and different rig and furrow and agricultural remains remaining, but unfortunately there are hardly any farm sites that have been found that date to before AD 1600. And much of the structures in this before the pre-improvement era, again, much like the early churches, don't really fall into the category of historic building recording, mainly as very little of their structures survive. So again, quick, what was happening before improvement. So this is medieval times. Most farming was at a subsistence level, with each small community aiming to produce enough food for its own survival. Barley and oats were cultivated, and cattle and sheep were kept for milk, meat, wool, and hides. Now, a typical farmstead from the 1700s might have several buildings and small enclosures surrounded by arable and pasture. The buildings could be arranged in either a linear fashion or kind of at right angles to each other. There was other buildings as well, like corn drying kilns, which were essential, but Louise will go on more into later mills and industries and things like that. Small round or square enclosure known as kale yards or planty crubs were used for garden cultivation of vegetables. You would have infield and outfield areas of cultivation, unenclosed, and the hill pasture was common for grazing, which was beyond these areas of cultivation, and is separated from the arable area by a head dike. So that's generally what you're looking at here. So you can see there's quite a bit of a mix of areas, and you can see these arable areas here that were, very unenclosed and just patches. What was most important, in constructional terms, the surviving remains of the pre-improvements are likely to be slight, not least because most houses and buildings were constructed with turf or clay walls and no foundations, except perhaps a footing of stone. Roofs could be of turf, wooden shingles, stone slabs, or thatch on a wooden framework, and the precious roof timbers were often taken down and reused for new houses. Now, the most recognisable kind of structure in the pre-improvement era farms was the spire dwelling idea. So the one on the right is obviously a lot of these, like I've said, it's the materials that were made of. You've also got the art of improvement, and a lot of places tended to see direct imposition of these later steadings on top of what was there before, as well as just reuse of material to make the newer steadings, which we'll look at in a wee bit. So the one on the right is a kind of very ruinous structure that was left of these byre dwellings. The one on the left, these are from out with our areas, but it was just to give you an example of a reconstruction drawing of one. There were generally, the definition of the byre dwelling was that you would have humans and animals living under the same roof using the same entrance, but either end, and they would essentially also be sharing heat. That was, so they would be in one big building. Now they can also be known as longhouses, or the black houses that you would see on like Lewis that you can see. But the reason why as well you get so it's so important to have these little kind of rural farms, museums that you see, rural life museums, tend to have reconstructions, or they've kind of Auchendrain is one. There's the rural one up in near Aviemore. And these are so great because, you know, you can actually get to see these buildings which don't exist. They're very, there's very few of them. They're only if they've really been reconstructed or specifically conserved in some way. Now, the after, post-improvement. Now, from the 18th century, the word improvement came to dominate all writing on agricultural matters in Scotland. Ways of forcing the land to produce more food were seen as of the greatest importance by political thinkers of the time. Now, the impetus for change grew out of the theories of Scottish Enlightenment and was made possible by the increasing wealth of the landlords and gentry. All of these factors led to a reorganisation of farming on a scale and at speed seen nowhere else in Europe. This transformed the landscape and had a profound effect on the lives of the people working the land. Now, it was just to say that the improvements didn't happen all at once in Scotland. They spread from region to region. So the general trend was that it started in the south to north, and it was lowland to upland. But yeah, so it differs, and there's always little local twists and things, but generally it's spread across all of Scotland. Now, one thing you can use for pre-improvement layouts is estate maps, which was a lot of times estate owners, landowners would hire on people to do maps of their lands, which were to help inform the improvements they would then go on to make. Although these are a mix. So this one's on the left, that top is the run rig kind of, so it's like lots of strips. So this was pre-improvement, and people, it was the names of the people that worked them, and they would be scattered in between each other because it was to share out the best possible land between everyone and make sure you got your bit. And then the one in the bottom left here is just to show this idea of kind of unenclosed farming all over the place, because the main thing you will see to show the improvement era is enclosure. So this is where obviously they enclosed off lots of areas of land. It's a lot more structured, a lot more organized. You can kind of see in the right hand side this example, and you'll see it now. It's what you see now when you drive around and you see all these nice lined out enclosed fields all around the place. This is improvement. This was the major, most visible impact that it had on the land. It would have taken the form of tuff banks, hedges, or stone dikes. And it was also a useful way of absorbing the stones cleared from arable land. Now, it also involved things such as the increased use of lime fertilizer to improve the soil. Improved drainage was introduced, and new machinery increased crop yields. There was many other factors at play. There was a significant shift from the farms being worked by groups of tenant families towards a single family unit. Now, the kind of fallout from improvement era was not always positive. Wasn't always popular. It wasn't always something that was taken well by the kind of locals and the people that work the farm. So definitely something you should look into if you want to find out a wee bit more about this kind of history. It's interesting. It's interesting stuff. But you can even see, looking at the First OS, this is where you start to see the enclosures everywhere. But what did improvement mean for their buildings? So the major focus of the improvements was to increase efficiency through the induction of a standardised layout to the farmsteads. So in came the courtyard farm. Now, this is something that once you see it, you can't unsee it. So you can see all across the First OS, you have all these, essentially the courtyard farm was the putting of a central courtyard, what you're used to seeing in farms really now. This was the improvement era. This came in at this point, and it was your central courtyard with your buildings arranged around either side. Now, it varied slightly, but this was also where the architects took to the drawing boards and, you know, started coming up with very grandiose plans about how to make it the most efficient they could. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so you see them all over Scotland coming out. This is a plan setting of a dairy farm. So you've got this, sometimes it could be a square, it was all enclosed area, or quite a lot often it used to be this kind of C-shaped or U-shaped steading, where you would have the central section and then the two wings coming either side. Now, they ranged in type from the formally planned home farms of large estates to more simple vernacular forms. The new steadings associated with improvement were usually stone built, increasingly commonly roofed in slate. And while the building layout became ever more standardised during this period with the increasing adoption of the courtyard style, there does not appear to have been a prescribed layout as to which buildings were used for which function, with this varying instead from farm to farm. Now, a standard C-shaped pattern evolved of a central farmhouse with these projecting wings on either side. One would be a byre, the other a barn, other storage. Now, all three elements tended to be single-storey, though some farmhouses must have been two-storey from the beginning. Now, the climate in the southwest of Scotland is temperate, with rain to encourage the growth of grass. This and the presence of smaller farms lends itself to dairy farming, and this is the industry which the southwest is most closely associated. Now, the positioning of the house at the centre of the courtyard layout is common in both Ayrshire and Renfrewshire, the reason being that it placed it within easy reach for tending to the cattle. Now, I've just put up some pictures. They're from all over kind of Scotland. That one is obviously Culzean. So it's just to get through to this idea that they were all about efficiency. It was all imposing these standardised courtyard layouts, but that didn't mean that they didn't like to still have a bit of style in there. Have a little bit of local fashion, a little trend, show off. So it was just to show you some examples, because there was a lot of architectural embellishments. So it just shows that visual considerations were important even in the smaller farms, perhaps revealing enthusiasm to keep up with the latest fashions or a chance to indulge in their own particular tastes. They also didn't necessarily get rid of the byre dwellings. They remained popular, but changing attitudes towards hygiene saw the targeting of more physical separation between byre and dwelling. So even in that earlier reconstruction that I showed you, that had a separate entrance. So they started to introduce separate entrances for animals and people. And then the even introduction of separate, and later even legislation that eliminated direct access between the two. So they weren't even allowed to share the same kind of space. But the byre dwellings did still continue to appear in some of the post-improvement layouts because they were such a popular building style of the time. So it was just to show you that even looking at farms, you can see so much more written in the buildings than just the brick and the masonry and the concrete and the mortar. You can see so much more in them, and especially with farmsteads, there's a lot more that I can't cover here, but yes, it's more than just an impact on the physical landscape. It also had far-reaching consequences for how people worked and lived and what they were used to. So I just wanted to see how important architecture farms was. But now, oh, I'm missing another slide, some more pretty slides. People did take it seriously, looking at putting together their farms. And you can actually see some examples where they're circular and semicircular. It's very impressive. You have a look through. But now I'll pass you on to Louise. I'll just mute myself, Louise, because I think you're talking for a wee bit. And then...
Right, and I've worked out how to unmute myself, which is very helpful. Okay, moving swiftly on, we're going to talk about industrial buildings. And these used to be prolific throughout the Garnock Connections area, but they're now becoming increasingly rare. So keep an eye open for them. When they've gone, they've gone. So industry, of course, goes back all the way to prehistory. People have been fabricating things, making things, processing things. Industries were prolific within the medieval boroughs, but we don't usually have much traces of them left. You usually only find out what's going on through excavation. But rural industry, we could argue that it began with the milling of grain, and that became mechanized in Scotland from the early historic period onwards with the introduction of water-powered mills. Claire mentioned them briefly in relation to the whole evolution of the farmstead. And small-scale water mills were very, very common and quite a frequent addition to your average well-heeled courtyard farm. And sometimes these involved a little kiln barn kind of building where you actually had the mill, corn drying kiln to dry your grain, and a barn where you could thresh and process the grain at the same time. So some of these are there to be looked out for. But my example today is a very late example of a small scale grain mill, which has its origins at least by 1850. as you can see from the first edition map here, but it was actually continuing in use until the 1950s. This photograph of Millbank Mill shows it in a sort of dilapidated state. It's accessible from the cycle track between Kilburney and Loch Winnoch, but seriously, guys, do not access this building. 20 years or 30 years ago, I visited it and went inside, which at the time was foolhardy, because it had stone, the millstones were in place within the wooden support system, which is called the gear cupboard. But since then, they have collapsed. And I would suggest that the building is in a very structurally unsound condition. So if you see it, view it from afar and admire the system of water management features, the lade, and the dam and the weir, etc. And don't go any closer, honestly. So lades are quite often the last thing to survive in an industrial site. So if you walk through the Col de Glen near Loch Winnoch, you actually, this was a place which was very populated with mills, and quite large mills, in the late 18th and early 19th century, but all you can really see of a lot of them now is just the line of the watercourse. But it's a good way of noting when things were there. Water-powered machinery is, of course, a very simple way of processing things. The flow of the water turns the mill wheel, which in turn turns a series of gears, and they operate the mill machinery. Quite often what they do is they would hoist the grain up to the top story of the building and then feed it down through the stones through a hopper at the top, and it would get processed between the stones with different sets of stones operating to a different grade of finished product, and then it would get bagged in sacks at the base. So the same principle also operates for windmills, though there aren't really many of those in this part of Ayrshire. You seem to have to, and Renfrewshire, you need to go further south. So you can see from this the idea of the small scale mill and the fact it was quite successful for a long period. There were larger ones. Yes, here we have the in situ gearing when the mill at Millbank was actually operating, and none of this is in place now. It's all pretty wrecked. Sometimes you get larger, right? And yeah, here we have basically the visual layout of this. So you can see how the material's brought up and comes down through the processing, through the stones, and how the gearing works in this cross section. So a very simple but very elegant method, and it's lasted for over 1,000 years. And the sizes of these mills vary. So you've got a larger kind of mill at Dalgarvan, and I would, once things get back to normal after this wretched pandemic, I would wholeheartedly recommend you go and visit Dalgarvan if indeed you haven't done so already. And if you're in luck, the actual mill will be operating, because there's a specific, these places sound interesting when they're operating. You hear the machinery going, and it's got a character all of its own. So yeah, make sure you pay it a visit if you can. But again, it's still quite a small scale mill, but in the 1760s, the Industrial Revolution started to take off, and it transformed milling and the whole scale of production. 1760 saw the introduction and invention of the water-powered spinning frame by Richard Arkwright. And this enabled numerous spinning frames to be operated at once. So instead of having one person spinning yarn or thread, you could have one person supervising a large number of machines spinning yarns and thread. So again, Claire was talking with her farms about efficiency. This was efficiency in industry, and it saw the start of mass production. 1780s, this was then transferred to actually the development of the water-powered loom. So not only could you spin your thread with a sort of in an efficient and mass-produced way, you could also produce your textiles. So around about this time, it was all dependent though, when you're using water power, on having a decent fast rate of water and a good sort of good flow. And Loch Winnoch was ideal for this with the Col de Glen. So it became a focus for water-powered industry from a relatively early date, with 2 large cotton mills noted as operating within the village in the statistical account of the parish, which is dated in 1799. So you can still see one of these still standing in the village, and that's the Col de Horse silk mill. It's now converted into flats, but it still retains much of its original character. Its walls are rubble built with stone, and this is typical of this period of industrial building. Brick only came into favour later, after the mid-19th century, when the railways made the transportation of bricks from the brick fields cheap and efficient, and probably cheaper and more efficient than actually quarrying fresh stone. So this is sort of typical of this early kind of mill building, and we're lucky to have this example surviving, plus mill owners' houses. Some of the large buildings in association or nearby were actually owned by mill owners and mill managers. But this is quite a modest structure compared with the Stonyholme mills in Kilburney, which are truly massive in their scale, and they give us a good example of how huge these enterprises could become when they became successful. Now, compared with Calderhall, this is a spring chicken of a building, because it wasn't established until 1831, where it was in use as a flax spinning mill. So again, it started out as water powered, but the widespread adoption of the steam engine resulted in its conversion to steam at a later point. Now, again, this is dependent again on the railway, and also the beginning of the exploitation in a huge scale of coal fields and the ability to move coal. Because when you're using a natural force like water, you are dependent on the flow of the water. So if you're in a period of drought, say, and your levels drop, your power output is going to drop and your productivity will drop. Also, more and more people are competing for the same resource. So if you're unfortunate enough to be further downstream and another 5 mill owners work upstream, you might start to lose your flow. So steam allowed a brilliant way of keeping your power consistent and within your control. So you see here at Stonyholme, and keep an eye open for this sort of thing, what appears to be 2 generations of engine house or boiler house. So we see the big tall one, which is stone built, rubble built with its arched windows. That to me has all the hallmarks of an engine house of some kind. And the little brick built building at the end, that looks like an engine or a boiler house as well. So you'd have the steam engine located here, and it would, again, power gearing, which would then operate the looms or the spinning frames inside the building. So again, when you're looking at big mill complexes like this, just look for the differences in material and start phasing them. And please don't waste your time in doing so, because these buildings are usually very fragile things. There's often not much use for them in the modern world, and they're difficult to maintain, expensive to maintain, and they're often sacrificed in the name of progress. Stonyholme, thank goodness, has got a devoted team of people and owners who are keen on keeping it, but plenty more have gone, and they vanish with alarming regularity. And I think that kind of brings us to our brief whistle-stop tour of industry. So I'm going to move, one more time. I'd forgotten the lovely internal features you get in some of these buildings. This is Stonyholme, and it's got this use of new materials in the cast iron roof trusses, and you can see they're actually using the wires to draw them together. There is a term for this kind of roof truss, and unfortunately I've forgotten it. It's up there with Claire's dog-toothed moulding and her carved capitals. All I can say is it's not a Belfast roof, but there is a specific term. And quite often another thing to look out for, and I think Stony Home's got it, but I haven't got any photos, unfortunately, is a floor which is made up of little brick arches, and it's called jack arch construction, and basically it's early fireproofing. So if you have this brick floor, your fire is going to stay confined and it's not going to break through to other levels. So that's something else to keep an eye open. Stony Home is quite often open on Open Doors Day, so keep an eye open, and if you get a chance, go and visit it. They are classy buildings. My last section is I'm going to be talking about towns and villages, and this is quite a practical approach, because towns and villages are very much places where space is used really intensively. So you kind of find that in a lot of places they're set in a limited area and have to make use of this limited area. So if you're looking at the urban townscape, again, you usually take them for granted, which is what I said at the beginning. You know, everything's just there and you walk past it every day. But the buildings can be incredibly complex because they reflect the intensity of land use, because it's only recently we've had conservation areas introduced, which kind of pickles everything in aspect. Modern towns tend not to accumulate. They tend to be planned in some way. And this started with the medieval boroughs way back in the medieval period. The medieval boroughs take a sort of consistent character, which is usually a single street which broadens out into a marketplace. And the land plots are laid out in linear burgage plots, linear strips, running back from this street with the houses placed end to end. So they form a closed terrace like this view of Loch Winnoch, with access through an arched pen to the backlands beyond. Now, Loch Winnoch isn't one of these early boroughs. It is quite late in date, with its origins in 1788, though there are probably earlier dwellings just were clustering around the old church. But it does represent a planned village, and like the medieval boroughs, it is set out around a preconceived scheme, which in this case was around the cross. So there are 4 streets leading away from this central crossroads. And it was built in order to accommodate the workers for the industrial buildings that we were talking about earlier. And Calderhall Silk Mill, I believe, was hoped to be employing 350 workers at around when it was going to be completed, just not long after 1799. So that kind of shows you why we need all this housing. So you can see from this view of this street in Loch Winnoch that there's a lot of variety in the houses. Some are 2-storey, some are 1-storey. They're all slated at the moment. Some towns have got formerly thatched buildings. They've had dormer windows added in the roof space. And if you look in the distance and you see that lovely pink building, it's got this thing called a Nepus gable, which is this lovely elevated gable, which is almost Flemish in its character. So houses can vary quite greatly. And again, the way in which they evolve can vary as well, compared to, depending on how much money and effort the owners throughout the years have had to change them. But if you're in a sort of town environment, keep an eye open for commercial buildings, such as banks like this one, which is now sadly disused in Loch Winnoch, and street fronts are another thing to look out for. The classic shop fronts, that's what I mean. The classic shop front with its large plate glass window is a comparatively late invention from the Victorian era onwards. But sometimes you can get some really well preserved ones with timber mouldings on the outside. Others have been replaced with sort of plastic fascias, and then they're not so pretty. But look for time depth there as well. and also in Loch Winnoch in particular, but elsewhere, there's some old painted signage from the 1950s. So that's something else to look forward to. I did try and take photos, but they didn't work out, sadly. But I'm actually going to take now one town building from Loch Winnoch, which is our Struthers Lemonade Factory. And it gives you a really good detailed case study of how buildings change and evolve over time, and how a bit of research can yield much more information about a specific structure, which in this case is very modest, as I said, and didn't really attract much interest. So it was always known in the village as the Struthers Lemonade Factory, but if you look at it on the first edition map, it's pictured there and it's labelled as a school. So it is shown as a rectangular structure with its small outshot at the northwest end, and it appears first in 1856, where it's labelled school, as we say, and the accompanying Ordnance Survey book describes it in more detail as, this is a very unpretending edifice erected close to the parish church. The school is on the lower flat and schoolmaster's residence on the upper. A good garden is attached. The higher branches of education are taught, and also English grammar, writing and arithmetic. Number of scholars from 70 to 80. So we're told that there was a building standing back here as far as 1856. And if we look back at our two-storey element with its very plain sash and case windows, we could agree that the upper portion of this larger building could represent its historic core, and the upper story would once have housed the schoolmaster. If you look at what exists today, you can see that maybe the core two-storey element and its one-storey outshot were part of this original building. And there may have been two door openings too at an early stage, one for boys and girls, but one for boys and one for girls, but we're not actually told if girls were educated here at this particular school. I'd also point out that these arched mouldings that you see around the doorway do appear to be later. So it's possible the doorways are later insertions and part of a subsequent remodelling. So if we move on to the second edition, we can see that the building has been extended through the addition of an L-shaped structure at the southwest end of the main building. So again, this is consistent with what we've seen in the photographs of the structure. And if we go back to their photos, you see that the building's extending back. So the form of this secondary structure with its low one-storey element, which is aligned north of east to southwest, and it terminates in the gable end wall of another building, it again matches what we see on the maps. So the building is still marked as a school in 1897. And it could be that this addition was added in order to accommodate girls and provide for their educations, with, as I suggested earlier, the moulded door openings being added at this point in order to accommodate both of them. So if we now move forward to 1911, we don't see any major change to the footprint of the building there's a revision of the map, but we do see the addition of the railway, suggesting improved transport links to and from the village. So we can infer that by this time the building is now in use as an industrial site, because local sources inform me that Struthers started operation around circa 1910. But the layout of the structure is unchanged. So it's kind of, you can infer from this that what we see in the later photos is actually part of this, this successive structure, which starts in the 1860s and moves onwards into the modern period in a fairly well-preserved form. Unfortunately, I couldn't get very good pictures of there's a big heavy rubble-built building which sits just to the rear of the white side elevation, the long side elevation here, and it looks quite industrial. But because my access to the site was limited, it was not possible to actually try and understand the real character of this building and try and figure it out in terms of its phasing. But I hope it's pointing out that with a wee bit of research and a wee bit of reading, you can see how the actual way in which a building was used changes quite profoundly. And that once it's gone, it's gone. With no photos and no records of this structure, you couldn't even do this basic interrogation of the structure, which I've been able to do today. So I hope what I've pointed out today is that even the humblest of buildings has got a story to tell if you go and look into it, and that your urban space, which you move through just about every other day, if not every day itself, has got a lot of stories to tell, and it's quite easy to just work your way through them and unpick some tangled narratives. And play.
I'll leave you on unmute, Louise, because I'll fire through this because I know that we are over time. But this is just a miscellaneous section of some random buildings. There's always something. There's always one that you walk across a field and be like, what on earth is going on here? So just a quick selection. First up is the Folly. Now this is a Castle Temple. I don't know if you have seen it or not, but you will, if you ever got the train from Ayr to Glasgow or back, you will. It's the thing that's sitting up on top of the hill that you'll probably always spot as you go by kind of Loch Winnock. Now it's called a folly on Canmore. I'm going to be forever grateful for trying to look up the definition of folly for this talk, as I came across the Folly Fellowship website, which is amazing. I would recommend looking that up because follies are wonderful little things. The entire point of a folly tends to be that it's a kind of ornamental piece that's been built. They came in kind of the 16th, 17th century, and then they took over in the next 200 years after that, became very popular. And it's really just rich people, better off people with estates that tended to build little follies, little kind of overly decorative, buildings that were meant to be seen. And so some examples of these are amazing. So this Castle Temple, now a very strict, narrow definition of a folly is that they have no purpose at all, have never had a function. But I think then that's very rare. There's usually something, whether it's got a bench in it or it's been used for a water tank or something like that, then yeah, so they kind of widen out and they include a few other different garden features. The problem with follies is they tend to be left behind from a designed landscape that has gone, and you just randomly get, for example, the Castle Temple sat on top of a hill, and it'll have this grandiose look to it, and you'll think maybe it's more than it actually was because they put quite a lot of effort into it. Now, this is a Category B listed building. It was built around 1776 by William McDowell of Castle Temple, and they said that they're looking at the maps of the estate from 1785. You can kind of see there was a number of radiating paths leading up to it, which suggests that it was conceived as a landscape feature with fine views over the estate and surrounding countryside. And it's possible that a deer park was established at Kenmure Hill, which is where this sits, and that the animals could be viewed from this lookout. Now, in the Canmore entry, it's worth mentioning that the 1950s entry said something about it was said to be used for a religious shrine. Now, I'm not sure that that's actually fact. I don't know. I'm not going to say it. Yeah, somebody might know more, but it's just to show what the problem is with these follies, is that they can look quite grandiose. But feel free, if somebody knows something more, let me know, send me to our website or something, that would be good. But generally talking about follies in general. Next up is ducats. Now, ducats can be lovely. They can be converted from earlier mill structures, we found some, or they can be later converted into other structures after they went use. But they are another part of a designed landscape, but they do have a practical function. There were pigeons, they were for holding kind of pigeons and doves, and which were an important food source in the medieval times. So they were kept for their flesh, eggs, and also their dung. Now, they're often freestanding structures built in a variety of architectural styles. Pigeon doves were a luxury item, with only the wealthy traditionally able to have dovecots on their land. And as such, they were often seen as a sign of status, constructed in prominent positions where they would be highly visible. Now, we call them ducats, but it's like another name for dovecot. It's the same idea. Now, this one is at Eglinton. It's a kind of large ornamental lectern style ducat. They have styles, and it dates back to the 1800s, which is the time of the castle. So that's why it has this kind of Gothic style look to it, because it fits in keeping with the castle. Another thing that looks a lot more grand maybe than it is. You can also see that there's there's a kind of landing platform at the top, but there's also the kind of jutting out stones. That's rat courses to stop rats getting up and down. And just the way to spot ducats is inside there'll be a series of cubby holes lining the walls, which they would use to nest in, and you'll also see access points coming in from the outside. Ice houses, these were essentially old-fashioned fridges that you'll find again in the kind of designed landscapes of an area. They were essentially usually close to natural sources of winter ice, such as freshwater lakes, but also rivers and streams. And they varied in design, but generally they were brick lined and conical, rounded at the bottom to hold melted ice. They also usually had a drain to take away the meltwater, and the majority of the construction was usually underground. Now, during the winter, ice and snow would be cut from the lakes or rivers, taken into the ice house and packed with insulation. It would remain frozen for many months, often until the following winter, and could be used as a source of ice during the summer months. Now, it was used to keep food fresh or to cool wine, sorbets and ice cream. It wasn't always clean enough for culinary use, the ice itself. So usually only large mansions had these purpose-built buildings to store ice. And just to say, the Eglinton Ice House is, if you look at the places that we know app, they've got a nice kind of bit on it, and I've lifted a wee bit out of the places that we know app entry for it, and it says the filling of the ice house was an important task, the duty of the head gardener, and managed by the house steward on a day-to-day basis. Whenever there was a severe frost, the Earl decreed that all gardeners and foresters stopped other work and gathered ice from nearby sources such as the Draught Burn and Curling Pond. It took several men 2 days of cold, arduous work to fill the ice house. The Castle Semple Ice House on the right hand side is a Category B listed building, so these are recognised as important features within the landscape. Next, the other main thing that I'll finish on is military remains, particularly in the kind of 20th century. You will find them scattered all about the place, and they also vary. The idea kind of World War II, particularly, but during the World Wars, is a lot of the time material was made up of what you could get your hands on. So they do vary a lot in what they're built from. But first up is the pillbox. So this is the most recognisable one that you'll have probably seen. There's more than 18,000 were built across Scotland in 1940. Now, this was a time in the World War II when the defeat of the Allied armies in France occurred. And so that was when they thought an invasion on British soil was most likely. So that was when suddenly all the home defences got a lot more secure, and a lot of things sprouted up at that time, including the pillbox. Now, I've got a kind of history to the pillbox, but I won't go into it. Move forward. But they tended to be associated with beach defences, stop lines and nodal points, although some were sited to defend coastal batteries, airfields, radar stations and factories. So this example is from Bishopton, which is just to the north of our area, which is where the ROF, the Royal Ordnance Factory, was located. So that would explain that. And yeah, they kind of have there's common features. There was about 12 designs, official designs that were issued from the Home Office for the layout of how pillboxes should be built. But obviously, like I said, it varied, depended on local preference and what they could get their hands on. But there were some common features, generally a squat, heavily constructed building, usually flat roofed, seldom more than 2 meters in height, and quadrilateral, polygonal or circular in plan. One or two, occasionally 2 entrances, and then of course the most obvious is the splayed horizontal slits, which can be called firing loops, loopholes or embrasures. Quickly, also military remains, which some people might know more than others, is the Royal Ordnance Corps. Yeah. Royal, I got that right. Royal Observer Corps. I knew that wasn't right. Royal Observer Corps, so the ROC. Now, these were established, this group was established in 1925. But the World War II, they're originally called the Observer Corps. In World War II, they were the first phase. They had 3 phases, sorry, to the ROC. And the first phase was in the World War II, and it was tracking aircraft during the Second World War. So it was like a kind of early monitoring system for when things would come up. So they achieved this, a network of posts were put up all across Britain. So this was a kind of UK-wide thing. Now, the Second World War is a little bit difficult. There's not a lot of them surviving. It tends to be quite local. They varied greatly in how they were constructed, and there's even a note saying frequently simply sandbagged emplacements, and even the most substantial were only of domestic brick construction. Now, I came across this photo of one from Arran, and I think I'm putting it as World War II. It didn't say that, but I wondered if it was maybe a possible contender, because it's not like the later ROC posts, and it is this kind of brick construction. The second phase of the ROC, which is what we can see on the right-hand side. Now, there's a lot more relating to this phase that have survived. And this is the introduction of Orlet observation posts in the early 1950s for the purpose of tracking Soviet jets. So 400 Orlet observation posts were installed across Britain, and they were built to a set design, which was two types, A and B. Type A would have been at ground level, while type B, which is one in the picture, would have been raised up off the ground on concrete stilts. So that's also something you can randomly see. They tend to have been stripped of all the internal stuff. They usually were kind of two compartment. There was the kind of area that was like that kind of shed, like they would sit in, and then there was the open observation area. But to fire through the third phase, so this was in the kind of, by the mid 1950s, radar was a lot more advanced. So they didn't really need the ROC anymore to try and track aerial planes coming overhead. So what they did in the 1950s and 1960s is they changed them to be about monitoring nuclear blasts and the fallout from such. Now, bearing in mind the ROC was a volunteer post. So yes, if there was a nuclear blast, they would jump into the bunker and they would stay there to monitor what the fallout was, all feeding back into central networks that then would go, then would mean that they could track where the fallout was going across Britain. So again, this was all over Britain, but the main thing architecturally is that it means that it moved underground, because this was supposed to be of more protection to the crew. But it means that on top, above ground, you'll see these surface features here, but that actually is representative of a below ground bunker. So just to let you know, and actually a lot of them are sealed. And as such, some of them are like little time capsules that have contained all the original paperwork, mapping, mattresses. People, they were set up in here, they stayed in here for several hours at a time. But yeah, so again, just random traces that you can find across the landscape. So I will stop on that. I know we're a little over, I'm sorry. I don't know if there's maybe been some comments. What I'll do is I'll stop share and I'll give I'm going to make Dig Ventures a host again, if I can. Oh no, I think they're still host actually, so that's okay, Harriet. Hi, Harriet.
It'd be fine, because you're a co-host this time. We've got a new feature for our ones too. So. So there have been a couple of comments. Frank has said that the Cold War ROC post at Skelmorley is restored and is open for public visits as well, which is amazing. So definitely a great one to go and see if you're particularly interested in World War II history and military history. So thanks for that, Frank. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up today? Anything that they would like to share or ask about?
Yep.
Go ahead, Colin.
Claire, this might be totally useless. Castle Semple Temple. I don't know why, but my father once told, and I don't know where he got this from, once told me that the gentleman that owned Semple, etc., had a link with India, and he brought back Indian servants, and the temple was for them to do certain prayers at certain times of the day in certain years. Now, where he got that from, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's the only mention I saw.
I've heard it said it was a tea house.
There you go. My father.
I mean, there's all sorts, because this is the thing. But I've heard people call it Castle Semple as well, because they just, Yes,
I saw that somewhere. They thought
there's
it was
so much lore about it. But McDowell, though, I think he's a Caribbean fellow. He got his money from the Indies, or the West Indies. So, but I don't, there's so many layers of history, Colin.
Listen, yeah. Listen, my dad was a bus driver and he did tours. So whether that was something he made up to entertain the tourists and entertain the family, I don't know. But as I say,
it's nice the way these things accumulate as well, you know.
Well, I don't know, Colin, it does appear in the Canmore entry. It did say it was used as religious, but that was all it says. It doesn't give anything more, and there's no. So that's two sources.
Listen, my father
I tried
was
to call the
religious.
tea house, but I mean, the thing that made me think tea house was actually because Auchin Cruve down in Ayrshire has got a thing called Oswald's Temple, which is classified in the listed building thing as a tea house. And it looks like Dowell has seen that or heard of that and tried to do an imitation up the road. And his wasn't Adam designed though. So not quite.
I don't know. Apart from you, Louise, I didn't come across any tea house reference apart from yourself. So
again, like Colin, I got it from verbal sources. You can see that there's locally, we've got lots and lots of tales relating to this structure, probably because it's sitting there in the middle looking enigmatic.
It's very memorable. You can see it from the train.
Yes.
You know exactly. I also want to quickly say sorry to Frank. Yes, I was going to mention Skelmerley and it went straight out of my head. So I'm so glad that you put that up because yes, I couldn't mention it without. I shouldn't have been mentioning the bunkers without mentioning Skelmerley. So sorry about that. Worried about time.
Excellent. Any more questions or comments from anyone? Wonderful. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed it today, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Our next talk will be on the 12th of May, if that's a Wednesday. It's always going to be a Wednesday. We will be looking at how archaeologists know where to dig in the landscape. Now, I'm not sure exactly what I can tell, how much I can tell you. But we are planning to hopefully do a dig somewhere in the region this summer, probably in June or July. And around that dig, we will also have opportunities for you to put some of this into practice. So there'll be an opportunity to have a go at some buildings recording with photographic survey and maybe a basic condition survey as well, which is just assessing the sort of preservation level and condition of the building. And for reading archaeology in the landscape as well, we will have the opportunity to do a field walk survey as well at that dig. So if that is something that you are really interested in coming along to when we're allowed to all be outside in a field together again, then I would strongly recommend coming to that talk next month as well. So as normal, I will send out the recording for this talk probably tomorrow or possibly Friday morning. And there'll also be an invite on the way to you for the May talk as well. So I hope that we'll see some of you there. So thank you to Claire and Louise again, and I hope that we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.